is the first of a two-part everyman examination of the drug LSD.
There is more to reality than meets a normal eye. Behind the curtain of everyday consciousness is hidden another, unutterably strange mental universe. It's the realm of mystical experience, and those who've been there describe the visit as the most significant event of their lives. Until recent times, it was a world known only to holy men, to saints, and perhaps to the insane. Then, a generation ago, this drug, LSD, escaped from the laboratory and was consumed by millions of young people. To some, it's a doorway to the mystical universe, chemical ecstasy, enlightenment in a bottle. To others, it's a dangerous and subversive poison. The drug challenges our very conception of reality, and its turbulent history raises sharp questions about the dividing line between private experience and public policy.
It would benefit most of all professors. I think it would be extremely good for almost anybody with fixed ideas and with a great certainty about what's what to take this thing.
LSD is the most dangerous drug that we have in the world today.
Acid is good for you kids. Go.
If you can reach a firm verdict about the right to use this fascinating, beneficent, but dangerous drug from purely personal experience, I envy you.
The remarkable effects of LSD were discovered by accident in Switzerland during the Second World War. Albert Hoffmann was then a young chemist working in the laboratories of Sandoz, a large pharmaceutical company.
The program I was involved was to study the active principles of medicinal plants. And one of these medicinal plants we were studying was ergot.
Ergot is a fungus that grows on corn. For centuries, midwives have used it to stimulate the uterus in childbirth. At Sandoz, Hoffmann was experimenting with ergot, trying to refine its effect. On the 16th of April, 1943, he was in his laboratory preparing a fresh batch of a compound he'd first synthesized 5 years before. It was lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD.
At the end of the synthesis, I got in a very strange psychic situation. A kind of dream world appeared, a feeling of oneness with the world, a very strange experience which reminded me to some experience I had in childhood. Sometimes when I was in nature, in the forest, in the wood, that I had some kind of, I would say, mystical experiences. The feeling of oneness, to be one with nature, the feeling to see now the true aspects of nature, the beauty, and which filled me with happiness.
Could it be that this pleasant, dreamlike state was in some way connected with the crystals of LSD that Albert Hoffmann was purifying that afternoon? He'd certainly not eaten any, but his fingers might possibly have brushed against a few traces of the compound. If so, then LSD was a remarkably potent drug. He decided to experiment on himself.
Being a cautious man, and I thought I would start with the smallest quantity, which even it could have any effect. Namely, I started with 0.25 milligram, and had the intention then to increase the dosage, get then to see if something would happen. But this very small dose, the first dose of my experiments I planned, was very, very strong.
Feeling increasingly unwell, Hoffmann was obliged to return home. It was wartime. He went by bicycle. As the journey progressed, the external world began to look stranger and stranger. By the time he reached home, normal reality had disintegrated.
When I entered this room, I was really astonished how this room had changed. The room itself and the objects in this room had quite a different form, different color, different meaning. The objects like this chair was like if he was a living object. It became moving from inside. It was so unusual that I really got afraid that I had become insane.
A kind next-door neighbor brought milk as an antidote.
Ich bring Ihnen ein Gläschen Milch, Herr Doktor.
She too was malevolently transformed.
Ich bring Ihnen ein Gläschen Milch.
The bizarre and terrifying hallucinations continued all evening. At times, Hoffmann felt that he was dead and had arrived in hell. But at last, 6 hours after taking the drug, he felt himself returning to the normal world. 2 days later, now fully recovered, Hoffmann reported his discovery to the head of the laboratory. 1 teaspoon of this new drug, LSD, could render 50,000 people temporarily insane.
I myself, and also, of course, a medical department, realized immediately that was a very important agent which could be useful in psychiatry and in research.
Sandoz distributed LSD to psychiatric hospitals as an experimental drug called Televised. No one really knew what medical use LSD might have, but this extraordinary substance deserved further study. Research soon showed that LSD closely resembles powerful natural chemicals in the brain, used to exchange messages between nerve cells. The drug acts like a false signal, disrupting the normal flow of information. One specific effect is to disable the region of the brain that filters information arriving from the senses. A flood of signals reaches consciousness and is experienced as an overwhelming deluge of sensation. The impact on the mind is profound. It's as if reality was suddenly uncensored, revealing a world exquisitely or horrifically transformed. All the senses are affected. Colors particularly are brighter and more vivid. Sound, too, is strangely transformed. sights are smelt and sounds are seen. Motion becomes a web of frozen moments. And often the world is strewn with bizarre distortions of reality. But hallucinations and pretty colours are only part of the story. LSD also affects the subconscious mind. In the early 1950s, psychiatrists began to investigate this aspect of the drug. All over the world, scientific papers appeared reporting the use of LSD in the treatment of psychiatric patients. The leading centre was Powick Hospital in England. Here, in a purpose-built facility known as the LSD block, hundreds of mentally ill people were treated with LSD. The consultant psychiatrist who pioneered this work was Ronald Sanderson. For a decade, he ran the Powick unit. Today, the LSD block has been converted into offices. Dr. Sanderson returns there to recall the past.
This is where we worked 30 years ago.
Yes, I didn't quite remember it as being this sort of shape. I remember something a different entrance from the corridor.
Ah, yes.
With him is Dr. John Whitelaw, a colleague from the LSD days.
This, remember, was the trolley area where the nursing staff used to set up the LSD ampoules. They draw the LSD out of the syringe, and we had a little medicine glass they poured it into, and distilled water was added to it. And they just used to stand where you are and drink the stuff. Most people noticed that the first effects came on after about 20 minutes, and somewhere in the first hour they would retire to their own particular room which had been allocated to them. And looked at from the outside, you might think there was nothing going on, because LSD doesn't have a marked effect on behaviour. What it affects is in internal mental processes. We used to have a little bed in the...
The point of giving patients LSD was to release suppressed memories and mental conflicts that psychoanalysts believe are the root cause of mental illness. LSD was perhaps a key to unlock the unconscious mind.
There's a curious kind of artifact in the early stages of LSD that people often have a great tendency to laugh, and that seems to be a sort of side effect. And I experienced it myself when I took LSD, and I wasn't quite sure. It wasn't funny, I wasn't laughing at anything, but I just had this thing. So that sort of sets a scene for experiencing greater emotional intensity. But with our patients, there was very often a great deal of fear, a great deal of crying, sobbing, and then, of course, one would want to move in and try and get the patient to relate that to what they're actually experiencing in themselves.
Given the reputation LSD has today, it's natural to wonder whether any patients were harmed by the drug.
We don't believe that anybody had a long-term psychosis. I know that cases have been reported from other parts of the world, but we examined our consciences pretty carefully in that respect, and I don't believe anybody was permanently damaged.
Extraordinary as it now seems, thousands of people were given LSD in psychiatric hospitals during the 50s. According to several independent studies, there were surprisingly few bad side effects. And a second group began to experiment with hallucinogenic drugs around this time. They were artists and intellectuals, and their inspiration came from the British writer Aldous Huxley. Huxley was fascinated by mystical experience and believed that a drug called mescaline might be a means to achieve it. Mescaline is found in a cactus called peyote, used by the Huichol Indians of Mexico. They regard peyote as sacred, and they've consumed it in religious ceremonies for centuries. Subjectively, the effects of mescaline are identical to those of LSD. The drug precipitates a charged and overwhelming journey of the soul. In 1953, Aldous Huxley sent an invitation to a British psychiatrist who had suggested a link between the effects of mescaline and the symptoms of schizophrenia.
He'd asked me, been down there for many reasons, but one of them was that he hoped that I'd give him mescaline. He'd been cleared by his doctor. This seemed to be one way out on my part. I was disconcerted that he'd bought a grey autograph, and so I had no way out, really. And so as on the second last day of my visit, I stood stirring in the mescaline, which has a strange, oily swirl. And I wondered if I would be remembered as a man who'd gone to California and driven Aldous Huxley mad. I thought it would be really a rather invidious reputation.
Thus it came about one bright May morning. I swallowed 4/10 of a gram of mescaline dissolved in half a glass of water, and sat down to wait for the results. After a while, I became aware of a slow dance of golden lights. I was looking intently at a small vase of flowers. My eyes travelled from the rose to the carnation, and to the smooth scrolls of sentient amethyst, which was the iris. I was seeing what Adam had seen on the morning of his creation, the miracle, moment by moment, of naked existence. I looked down by chance and went on passionately staring by choice at my own crossed legs. Those folds in the trousers, what a labyrinth of endlessly significant complexity. This is how one ought to see, how things really are. Now someone produced a phonograph and put a recording on the turntable. The voices were a kind of bridge back to the human world. The uneven phrases of the madrigals pursued their course, never sticking to the same key for 2 bars together. And suddenly, I had an inkling of what it must be like to be mad. I found myself on the brink of panic, disintegrating under pressure of a reality greater than a mind accustomed to the cozy world of symbols could possibly bear. None too soon, I began to return to that reassuring but profoundly unsatisfactory state known as being in one's right mind. The man who comes back through the door in the wall will never be quite the same as the man who went out.
The world he saw that May morning in 1953 profoundly impressed Huxley. A name was required for a substance that could provoke such revelatory experience.
Aldous suggested phanerothym, a phaneroin to reveal and thumos the soul. And he then wrote this little rhyme, to make this mundane world sublime, take 1/2 gram of phanerothym. And I thought this was a wonderful word, but rather too difficult for most people. It was a Huxley word, so I wrote back to him, having looked up in the dictionary the fact that the word psyche, of course, was available, and so was de Luon to reveal, and about 6 others. But I fixed on psychedelic and wrote back to fall in hell or so angelic, you'll need a pinch of psychedelic.
In your book about mescaline recently, you talked of a valuable state of heightened perception, being induced by drugs, by proper drugs. Do you think imaginative writers would benefit by that?
Well, I think the people who would benefit most of all are professors. And this, I think it would be extremely good for almost anybody with fixed ideas and with a great certainty about what's what, to take this thing and to realize that the world he has constructed is by no means the only world, that there are these extraordinary other types of universe which we may inhabit and which we should be very grateful for inhabiting, I think.
Not everyone shared Huxley's enthusiasm. The British writer Arthur Koestler responded in an essay with a parable. He likened consumers of psychedelic drugs with those who drive to the top of a mountain instead of climbing it step by step. The view, he concluded, may be identical, but the vision of the climber is different from that of the motorist. Such criticisms, however, only encouraged interest in Huxley's account of his mescaline experiments, and others began to follow in his footsteps.
Well, here I am in my home, and before I take the drug, Dr. Osmond's got one or two quite unrehearsed questions, I've no idea what they are, to put to me.
Right, Christopher.
Carry on.
Could you tell me the date today, please?
The date?
Yes.
It was Friday, the 2nd of December.
In 1955, Christopher Mayhew, MP and TV presenter, took mescaline under the supervision of Humphrey Osmond. The BBC filmed the experiment. This is the first time it's been shown.
To be rich and prosperous, a nation must have a safe, secure supply of wood.
After initial psychological tests, the experiment began at noon.
Shall we go right ahead then? And
I'll take it.
Yes, there she is.
Well, I'm feeling perfectly fit at the moment and as sane as I ever am, and I'll take the drug now.
An hour and a half later, there were definite effects.
Could you perhaps tell us any particular colour which you think...
Yes, there's colour just behind Tubby there.
Yes.
There's this colour of... damn, I warned you, Humphrey, that on colours my vocabulary is bad.
Are you talking about the reddish curtain behind Tubby?
Yes, and in fact it has the most extraordinary gradations of mauve and lights. Sorry, this is just my own poverty of vocabulary. I can't describe it.
Would it surprise you if I said it looked to me a rather dullish red curtain, which has very few...
Intellectually, I'd be amused, Humphrey, yes.
Now, who would you feel in this situation, whose judgment would you feel was sounder?
Now you're asking me, this is the $64 question, whether I'm seeing the curtain more nearly as it is, or whether I am intoxicated and seeing pink elephants, which is, of course, the thing that fascinates me about it. Well, all I can say is it's still a $64 question, Humphrey. I'm looking very hard now, beyond the camera.
Today, elevated to the House of Lords, Christopher Mayhew watches the film with Humphrey Osmond.
About whether it's good evening or good morning.
But you also said the thing you weren't sure whether it was...
Now I'm back lucid again, and I see that the sentence I meant to say can't be said.
I think this is the most interesting thing I've ever done. And I say that after 30 years in which the whole ghastly business, you know, has been depreciated, when drugs have been abused, when this is our major social problem. I mean, I do know all that, and I hope and pray it never helped anybody to experiment with drugs. Nevertheless, the actual experience seems to me to have been profoundly interesting and thought-provoking.
The time's now just on 1400, and in the last half hour or so, Christopher has been preoccupied to a very great extent with time, and we've had numerous discussions on this. In the interval, he tried to instruct me as to how to work his recording machine, and unfortunately we were quite unable to work it. He has also been listening to a certain amount of music. Now I'm going to ask him once more to go over the Babcock sentence that I did, and also to take away 7 from 100. Now, Christopher, would you be prepared to do that for me, please?
Well, you've got me at what I would call my period of time when I'm capable of doing it.
Right. Well, I'll now repeat the sentence. To be rich and prosperous, a nation must have a safe, secure supply of wood.
To be rich and prosperous, a nation must have a safe, secure supply of wood. I got the two right.
Well done. Now, would you like to take away 7 from 100 again?
93, 86, 79, 72, 66, 72, whatever it is, 65, 58, 51, 40, I can see you're interested still, 44, 37, 30, 23, 23. Now I'm off again, Humphrey.
Mm-hmm.
In my period of time, I'm off again for a long period, but you won't notice probably that I've gone away at all.
Perhaps half a dozen times during the experiment, I would be withdrawn from my surroundings and from myself and have an experience, a state of euphoria, for a period of time that didn't end for me. It didn't last for minutes or hours, but for months.
I do try and assure you that from my point of view, between the time that I perhaps begin the sentence and the time that I end it, I shall have gone, a long time will have elapsed, Humphrey, and
the psychiatrists afterwards, and common sense, they all said, this is nonsense. You couldn't have had these experiences because there was no time, as the film shows, there's no time for you to have them in. And the psychiatrists would speak, and I accept this, that I was simply showing the symptoms of what they call the disintegration of the ego. I accept that too. At the same time, they didn't have the experience. And when I look back, even now, after 30 years, when I remember that after the experiment, I remembered that afternoon, not as so many minutes spent in my drawing room, interrupted by these strange excursions in time, but as years and years of heavenly bliss, interrupted by short periods in my drawing room. When I recall it, and when I recall various other symptoms, I think the simplest explanation is that I had these experiences, that they were real, and that they took place outside time.
I am moving at this moment from one time into another time and back again. And I'm not so conscious, Humphrey, of removing myself in space, but I'm extremely conscious of moving in time, of things having no succession, and of there being no absolute time, no absolute space. It is simply what we impose on the outside world.
The BBC was worried. Could the film be broadcast? Mayhew himself was all in favour, but viewing the footage, it was hard to judge the true significance of his experience. Expert advice was called for, and a special committee of psychiatrists, philosophers and theologians assembled. Amongst those shown the film was Canon Besant from Cambridge University. From a religious standpoint, he felt Mayhew's mystical adventure had been obtained on the cheap. The others agreed, and the committee had no hesitation in reaching a verdict when asked by the BBC whether or not Mayhew's experience was valid. The film was never shown.
I think that the experience was valid. I think, for the reasons I've given, that you can dismiss it as a dreamlike hallucination which lasted a fraction of a second, owing to the disintegration of my ego and so on. Or you can say with me, it was a real experience which happened outside time. And that is my view. And for various sort of associated symptoms, I would say that on that occasion, by a shortcut, I did visit the world known to the mystics and to some mentally sick people. And therefore, to that extent, I'd say it is valid.
Huxley, too, was attacked by theologians. The Roman Catholic scholar R.C. Zehner wrote an article dismissing the doors of perception. He argued that wide differences in people's response to the drug cast doubt on individual claims to enlightenment. So that he could write with authority, Zehner arranged to take a dose of mescaline himself. Overcome by hysterical laughter, he found the experience to be spiritually empty, and he concluded that Huxley's claims had no more credibility than the delusions of a lunatic. Zehner maintained that the visions of the great Christian mystics were something entirely different. Those who believe in the value of psychedelic drugs see no clear distinction.
I believe that the experiences one has under LSD are very similar, even identical with mystical experiences. There has been discussion along this with scientists, but if you compare the reports of mystics, of the saints, the text reports with reports on people who had mystical experience under LSD, you cannot find any difference.
Can the mystical experience of saints really be duplicated by chemical means? 30 years after R.C. Zehner raised the question, his successors at the University of Oxford are still debating it. One of them is Richard Swinburne of Oriel College, who is Nolloth Professor of the Philosophy of the Christian Religion.
Taking drugs to get into the presence of God is barging into the presence of God. And if you just go and have an experience, you're simply not equipped to recognize the experience for what it is and to react to it in the right way. So, for that reason, no, I wouldn't take drugs. There's so much more to religion, indeed almost everything more to religion than having experience. It's a dedication to a way of life which indeed can be very much reinforced by experience, but experience isn't the point of it.
Spiritual self-transcendence was hardly the ambition of another group interested in LSD and mescaline during the 1950s. The American government were attracted to hallucinogenic drugs for less savory purposes. Former intelligence officer and author John Marks has uncovered the CIA's secret research with LSD.
In the early 1950s, the CIA and American military intelligence were funding the lion's share of the research on LSD. You can give the intelligence agencies an awful lot of credit for starting a field of experimentation into these sorts of drugs.
Through the Freedom of Information Act, Marks has obtained copies of classified CIA documents that reveal why the agency was interested in LSD.
The essence of the intelligence business is control. This was an instrument or a potential instrument for breaching people's control, for making them commit acts against their will.
In 1963, the CIA produced an internal report so sensitive only one copy was made. It concerned MK Ultra, a project that involved the testing of LSD on unwitting American citizens throughout the 1950s.
They wanted to know how a diplomat might react if given LSD at a party, how a foreign leader might react if given LSD just before he was to get up and give a speech, how it might be used in interrogation of prisoners or something of that sort. Given the fact that the CIA felt it had to do that kind of testing, they had to find unwitting test participants who, by definition, couldn't be told they were being given the drug. And so what the CIA did is it looked for people who were, let's say, on whose lives they put less value than on the life of an American scientist or a businessman or someone of that sort. The CIA turned to people like drug addicts, prostitutes, prisoners, inmates in mental hospitals, and used them as test subjects.
People who did not know what happened, they believed they became insane, and all kind of accidents happened following these kind of ingestions. That was really a crime. To give people without their knowledge these agents is a crime.
The American military were also experimenting with LSD as a potential weapon.
Here is a group of normal soldiers responding correctly to a series of routine drill commands. After receiving a small dose of LSD, they're confused and undisciplined.
The idea was to spray the drug on enemy troops. The dose, however, proved rather difficult to control. And there was a different kind of fallout from these experiments, one that took the Army and the CIA entirely by surprise. Civilians exposed to LSD began to do strange things.
I believe with the advent of acid, we discovered a new way to think. And it had to do with piecing together new thoughts in your mind that produced people like Bob Dylan and John Lennon and William S. Burroughs, that were using new images together in a way that jarred the mind and produced images that were latent in our consciousness, but were not being brought about by reading Vanity Fair or Woman's Home Companion.
In 1960, CIA-funded researchers at the Menlo Park Hospital in California were paying students $40 a day to take LSD. One volunteer was Ken Kesey, psychedelic folk hero, author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and today a farmer in Oregon.
You were in a little room pretty much by yourself. There was a window with wire grating on it, and through that window you could look out and see a lot of people out there who understood a whole lot more what you were going through than these doctors. And my metaphor for the thing was, it's as though these people had discovered a room, and they thought there was something in that room of value to them, but they didn't want to go in there. So they hired students to go in there, and after a number of those students came out with a wild look in their eye, they said, close up that room and don't let anybody else go back in that room. And that's when I found that my key fit the doctor's office and decided that this was too important a business to leave in the hands of the government.
Awed by the power of the drug, Kesey began to distribute it to his friends. Across America, LSD was leaking out of the laboratory.
I've always thought that this is one of those things that proves that God has a sense of humor. That if Gabriel come up and says, hey, Chief, the Americans are really messed up down there. We're going to have to do something to straighten them out. They've got a nosedive karma going on. And God says, well, send them some of that stuff you've been working on, that acid stuff, and have the CIA distribute it. You can hear the celestial laughter when you realize it was the CIA that really turned on America.
In the early 1960s, 20 years after Albert Hoffmann bicycled unsteadily home from the laboratory, his discovery was poised to kindle a revolution among the young of the West. For the father of LSD, it was an alarming prospect.
I knew from the use of this kind of substances in old cultures by the Indians, there is a taboo on these substances. They are only used in religious setting and are in the hands of the shaman, not in the public. And the shaman in our society is a psychiatrist, and it should remain in the hands of the shaman. And therefore I really became skeptical and anxious that bad things could happen, and it happened indeed by the unwise and uncontrolled use of this substance.
Next week, in the second of these two programs, Everyman follows the bizarre and sometimes tragic events as LSD exploded onto an unsuspecting world.